Shalom, shalom, friends, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Unapologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about... Oh, wait, hang on. Wrong show. Ha ha. That's funny. Oh, my goodness. I haven't done this in so long that I just totally had a little brain fart. This is not that show. This is a different show, actually. Welcome to the Watchdog. Ha ha ha. I am still your host, CJ Cox, but I am not here to give you apologetics, but rather here to tell you that we are living in biblical times. And thank you guys very much for being here today. I very much appreciate you. If you are interested in this kind of thing, please do remember to hit that like button as well as the share button. Get this out to all the different social media platforms that you partake in. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? Also, would very much appreciate you guys, like I said, subscribing, hitting that bell if you think that this is good political commentary. More often than not, what I am commentating on is actually stuff that is global and or Middle Eastern. It's not as American-centric as a lot of other American shows, but we do talk a lot about American politics also, of course, from a traditionalist, conservative, and Christian perspective. If you guys are interested in any of that sort of stuff, I absolutely do appreciate you subscribing here to the channel. I want to go ahead and welcome Honesty Angel, who I see here today. Shalom, shalom, and thank you for being here today. Want to go ahead and let you guys know, even though I've already been doing a hiatus, and that itself was in between another hiatus, I still have one last hiatus to go, and that is because I'm actually taking a trip down to South Dakota. And I don't know how many of these watchdogs I'll actually be able to get on. At some point, I want to make sure that we're doing these absolutely consistently. There is some awesome things in the work and also some awesome things that I have to show you guys today. And so that's going to be actually the first portion of this in my pre-article discussion, is just showing you guys some of this awesome stuff. Or one of these awesome things, I should say, because it is now finished. So, I got a new overlay made by a good friend of mine, a good friend being Nicholas Whitmer, proclaimer of Messiah. If you guys know who he is, if you guys don't know who he is a apologist and YouTube minister who's a good friend of mine from over on the other channel where I am doing apologetics and stuff of that nature. Definitely check him out, Nicholas Whitmer, or just proclaimer of Messiah. He gave me this. Actually, and I want to make sure that it actually works as far as the screen sharing portion of it is concerned. But it is definitely, this is the first time I'm actually like getting it out to you guys. It looks like it does, right? And yeah, I think it's a really, really cool thing that we have here now. That basically shows the spotlight sort of aspect that we have here. It's got the logo obviously there in the corner. No necessity for the synagogue logo because I'm not actually on the screen at the moment, but I'm going to find a way to incorporate that here. I can't use the watermark because it covers up the watchdog thing over on the side. And obviously you can see the spotlight here goes down onto the article like we are illuminating the article there. Again, credit there goes to Nicholas Whitmer, proclaimer of Messiah, for making this absolutely awesome overlay. I was quite pleased with it. As you can see over there on the top, not only did he have the logo, which of course was made by Jamie Russell, who I see is in the chat. Shalom, brother. But he actually added the little splotch there of blood, which is actually itself a little bit of a Watchmen reference. So that was kind of cool too. It is a very cool thing here, and I think it's nice that we're getting more and more official looking, right, when it comes to this program and how everything is working. So I absolutely appreciate Jamie Russell for the logo. I absolutely appreciate Nicholas Whitmer for this overlay. I'm going to go ahead and get some transitions and an intro made here soon. I don't know by who, I don't know how, but I do know exactly what I want, so that's nice. And yeah, this is all getting really good, and for not a lot of money at all, praise the Lord, which is nice because I don't have a lot of money, right? So it's very helpful that I have people who are willing to help me, right? So it's very nice anyway. But I'm going to figure out somebody who can animate and stuff like that so I can get the intro done. I'm going to also work to do this for my unapologetics as well. Although, of course, there's going to be a different flavor there. This is a political podcast, whereas that is a apologetics podcast, right? I do see Brother Jamie say that you may be willing to and able to help. We'll definitely talk about that for sure. So I appreciate you there. But nonetheless, now that I've showed you, this is going to be the overlay from now on. And we have got some very interesting things to talk about. So the Israeli presidential election took place on June the 2nd. As many of you know, I was actually predicting a Yehuda Glick victory in the Israeli election. Rather than winning, Yehuda Glick actually dropped out of the race in May 19th. So I actually was wrong in that aspect. The person who did end up being elected was Isaac Herzog. On top of that, rather than having a fifth election, which is what everybody expected to occur in Israel, we actually saw the members elected in the fourth election in the last 2 years, the one that happened in March, form a new coalition, a new government that actually did not include the majority party Likud, nor the current prime minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And if this ends up going through, we might actually see Benjamin Netanyahu leave office, which would be a pretty incredible thing considering the fact that he has ruled Israel now for over 10 years, right? And of course, this is his second stint as prime minister. I guess I shouldn't say, of course, that's not maybe common knowledge, but this is his second stint as prime minister. Now, there's a lot of things to talk about, namely, who are the different members of this government? What are the different parties and what do they stand for? Who is the person who's going to replace Netanyahu? If Netanyahu is replaced, there's some recent accusations that Netanyahu is making and so on and so forth. So we've got our work cut out for us as far as that is concerned here today. And that is where we come to the first article here, actually, which is, as you can see, I'm actually in the process of making it. Benjamin Netanyahu claiming election fraud. At least that is what we're being told. And I'm here to tell you that what we're being told in that regard is actually the case. Benjamin Netanyahu is now claiming election fraud. And it's interesting. This idea of election fraud seems to be rearing its ugly head pretty consistently and constantly since the year 2016. It started with a bunch of nations claiming Russian election interference, election interference in Brexit, Russian election interference in Donald Trump's election. There was apparently election interference in the support for Le Pen and Tommy Robertson and UKIP and stuff like that, even though those parties ended up not actually winning in their respective countries, namely the UK and France. A lot of right-wing parties ended up being elected in like Sweden and Greece and Italy and so on, and people thought there might be some Russian interference there. And then after 2016, when we have all those claims of Russian interference, then not only was there again claims of Russian interference in regards to 2018 and 2020, but then there was also claims of the election being stolen by Donald Trump, right? In other words, the claims were made by Donald Trump, as well as by many other conservatives, saying that the American election was stolen. We then saw that in Myanmar, which we will be talking about again in another episode, hopefully this week. They were alleging election fraud and indeed had a military coup because of it. Now we see in Israel, there is also a claim of election fraud. And so it does seem to be pretty consistent and common now for people who don't seem to get their way politically to claim election fraud. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that any of these claims are or are not legitimate. Obviously, they each need to be taken on their own individual basis. However, it is important to note that this is seemingly a trend going around with people saying there's election fraud here and election fraud there. And it's also very interesting that even though this election happened in March, Netanyahu was not claimed election fraud until after it became impossible for him to make a unity government. Now, there are some important things to note in this new unity, and we're going to get to those things in a second. But before we get to those things, we do need to actually address this point, which is that Netanyahu is alleging election fraud. And of course, the results of Netanyahu's, claims here could be varying, and we'll discuss a lot of that after we get to the points of the article. But nonetheless, let's get to the article here. It's actually where I'm reading it from is Yahoo News, but it originally comes from Reuters. So Yahoo News is not the original source. And the article says Netanyahu alleges Israeli election fraud and accuses rivals of duplicity. Again, Netanyahu alleges Israeli election fraud and accuses rivals of duplicity. This is written by Jeffrey Huller on June 6th, 2021. That is yesterday. And again, that's by Jeffrey Heller. He says, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Sunday, a newly formed Israeli coalition that is poised to unseat him was the result of, quote, the greatest election fraud in the history of democracy, end quote. Definitely taking a tip from our own former President Trump as far as go big or go home when you're selling your case. Obviously, that's a pretty common tactic in regards to rhetoric. But nonetheless, that is something that Benjamin Netanyahu has certainly taken from his former ally and the former president. Hours after Netanyahu's comments, Naftali Bennett, a nationalist set to replace him as prime minister, called on Israel's longest-serving leader, not to leave scorched earth behind and accept, quote, people are allowed to establish a government even if you don't head it, end quote. Now, what's interesting real quick about Naftali Bennett, who we'll get into a little bit in a second, is that Naftali Bennett actually used to be an ally of Benjamin Netanyahu, and ideologically, they actually agree on an awful lot of things. Naftali Bennett's primary reason for being opposed to Netanyahu is actually Netanyahu himself. Bennett is under the impression, as many Israelis are, and as honestly might be the case, that Benjamin Netanyahu is very involved in corruption and that he's a little bit more interested in his own personal power and establishing himself, even potentially to the point of a personal dictatorship, than he is helping the Israeli people and pushing forward what they would consider to be a right conservative agenda. Excuse me. Now, it's important to point out that Naftali Bennett has his own problems, right? The Israeli right, while people who a lot of us here in the American right would probably agree with, and I, as somebody who am very much a student of Israeli politics, certainly am, somebody who, if I lived in that country, would be on the spectrum or on the right side of the spectrum, right? It is important to note that the Israeli right, like many right-wing parties in the European world, right, something that we don't tend to have a problem with here in the United States, is they're very prone to radical extremism, whether that be ethnocentrism or whether that be just generally statist nationalism or whether that be some level of religious sectarianism. Regardless, Israel, like many other nations across the world, does actually have that particular problem on its right wing. The United States has had the great luxury of never actually having right-wing people of that nature having any serious power or sway, although you could certainly argue at certain points in time that was the case. We've also had the great luxury of having the exact same be true for our left wing. Up until recently, even the idea of being socialist was very frowned upon, and our left wing were people like the Clintons, Obama, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, et cetera, right? Not people like Karl Marx or even Bernie Sanders, right? Which is a very recent development on our left. And that's a great luxury that we have in the United States, but it is important to note that in Israel, that is not the case. And Naftali Bennett does have his own problems we'll get into in a moment. But he is right here that people have the right to establish a government, even if Netanyahu does not head it. And I tend to agree with critics of Netanyahu that he is actually interested in his own power and that potentially even poised to become a dictator. He certainly seems to be involved in election fraud. He certainly seems to be willing to sacrifice national unity and stability for the sake of his own personal power. He also seems to be a little bit of a puppet to certain international forces, namely the Republican Party of the United States, although that is really no different from other Israeli leaders, as the Rabbi Meir Kahane would frequently point out. Israel is in many ways a puppet state of the United States, as are many other nations in the world. But nonetheless, Netanyahu made his sweeping accusation at a time when Israel's domestic security chief has warned publicly about the prospect of political violence. And we're going to actually get to a example of the Israeli police barring a demonstration of right-wingers, or at least claimed right-wingers, because of this threat of political violence, threat of a January 6th style political violence, as the chief of the security chief, rather, has pointed. I was about to say chief of staff. That is not accurate. The security chief has claimed, at least. Quote, "We are witnessing the greatest election fraud in the history of this country, in my opinion, in the history of any democracy," end quote, Netanyahu said in comments to legislators from his right-wing Likud party. He focused his allegations on a broken campaign promise from Bennett, who had pledged not to partner with left-wing centrist and Arab parties. Now, it's very important to point out here that Netanyahu is being a politician. He's using rhetoric. He's being hypocritical. Why do I say this? Well, because as was reported on this show before, Netanyahu himself has been willing to make these sorts of compromises. The Ra'am party, which is a part of the current coalition of 61 members, which we will actually show you towards the end of this program. Actually, we'll probably do that before we get to Herzog and Bennett. So scratch that. So it'll probably be directly after this. But nonetheless, that Ra'am party, which is not just Arab, an Arab party, but an Islamist party, yes, meaning political Islam, that party was actually being poised to be a member of the new coalition government Netanyahu was going to head, that was also going to include Haredi parties, meaning ultra-Orthodox, as well as religious Zionist parties, which is important to specify because for the most part, ultra-Orthodox parties tend to be anti-Zionist. So we were going to see religious Zionists, ultra-Zionists, anti-Zionist, and Islamists all in the same coalition. We came very close to that. That ended up not being the case, at least if what has recently developed does end up coming to fruition. He focused his allegations on a broken campaign promise, as I said, from Bennett, who had pledged not to partner with left-wing centrist and Arab parties. On Wednesday, Bennett announced with opposition leader Yair Lapid, that they had formed a governing coalition with factions from across the political spectrum, allowing an inclusive March 23rd, following rather an inconclusive March 23rd election, Israel's fourth in 2 years. Which it's important to note the reason they did this was for purposes of stability. This is essentially a two-pronged government, and it probably will not last particularly long, though it may succeed in its ultimate goal. The two prongs of this government is that, number one, they really want to stop this whole cycle of elections. So it's a stability government, right? We're sacrificing our ideologies, our agendas, our goals for the stability of the nation. And that's actually quite admirable in a lot of ways. Obviously, you do not want the nation to crumble. Now, of course, you do not want to sacrifice the truth. You do not want to sacrifice what is good, what is right, what is just. And we'll get into whether or not I think they are doing that. However, it is important to note that, that we were talking about the potential of now a fifth election in roughly 2.5 years. Also, the presidential election was happening in June. And this is obviously a matter of stability in the country. Israel itself could end up falling at some point if unity is not actually maintained. So there's obviously a lot of admirable quality within the formation of the government in that prong. Although, as I think is made clear in cases for like national unity and religious unity, international unity rather, and religious unity, we cannot have ultimate unity at the sacrifice of truth, right? But nonetheless, the second prong of this is really anti-Netanyahu sentiment. People are kind of sick of Netanyahu in the nation of Israel. They really want him gone. And this may come as a shock to American evangelicals and to American Christians and even to American Jews. But Netanyahu has really overstayed his welcome in the nation of Israel, at least according to a lot of people. And there's a lot of reasons for this, some of which I absolutely agree with, and many of which I absolutely agree with, in fact. And I myself have been somewhat turned against Netanyahu as a leader. I think he's gotten a little bit of a taste of power, and it seems that he wants to be a dictator. So just some of the things that Netanyahu has done that has caused people to not really appreciate him include, but are not limited to, taking bribes, using his position as prime minister to not be investigated or have any sort of charges brought against him when it comes to these bribes. Excuse me. Giving the ultra-Orthodox parties a ridiculous level of power to the point of being able to restrict conservative and reform Jews, which are sects of Judaism. They are not, conservative does not mean conservative in the way you think of it. That would actually be Orthodox Jews. Conservative is actually a, ironically, liberal sect of Judaism. But nonetheless, what giving these ultra-Orthodox more and more power would do is it would allow, rather, these ultra-Orthodox to basically refuse conversion to reform and conservative sects. These people would not be considered properly Jewish. It would also allow them to, make it more difficult for these people to immigrate to the state of Israel, make it more difficult for their children to be considered properly Jews. It would also delegitimize conversions to these sects entirely, as well as marriages within these sects entirely. It would also, and this may not actually change under Naftali Bennett, unfortunately, allow them to persecute, and I mean seriously persecute, Jews who they did not like. For example, Karaite and Messianic Jews, and also very much racially, Ethiopian Jews. Something that is not talked about very often is the fact that there is very, very clear racial bias against Ethiopian and Black Jews, coming from the ultra-Orthodox community. I know it may come, once again, as a shock to American conservatives, especially considering the fact that that is something that American liberals very often use against American conservatives dishonestly. But it is absolutely the case in the state of Israel that there is racial stigmatization against Black Jews, specifically coming from not Ashkenazi Jews or Mizrahi Jews as a whole, meaning white and Middle Eastern Jews, but from the Haredi ultra-Orthodox Jewish sects, which is interesting because, of course, there are certain Ethiopian and otherwise Black Jews who would be in that camp themselves theologically. But this persecution has been real bad with these three groups in particular, Ethiopian Jews, Karaite Jews, and Messianic Jews. In the case of Messianic Jews, it is manifested in violence, though not state-sponsored violence, state-ignored violence, particularly in the so-called West Bank region, more properly identified as Judea and Samaria. In the case of Karaites, it's caused them to be essentially delegitimized and not considered to be Jewish at all, though it has not manifested in mob violence against them. And in the case of Ethiopian Jews, it has resulted in their not being recognized as Jews and also as not being recognized as Israeli citizens, not being able to get the same rights as Israeli citizens. And this has been something that has caused a lot of people to be dissuade from the Netanyahu government, especially considering the fact that the only reason he made these deals with them in the first place is so he himself could maintain political power. There are parties who absolutely would have signed on with him, who agreed with his agenda, but who did not support this ultra-Orthodox power, including, by the way, parties which were ultra-Orthodox, right? Parties in the Kahanist line of thought, which tend to have a very, what I call Hebrewist outlook on the state of Israel, meaning that all who are ethnically Jews should have safe haven and human rights within the state of Israel. That would include Karaite Jews, that would include Messianic Jews, although that is, the Messianic one is real complicated because a lot of people in this Kahanist line would say that Messianic Jews have completely forfeited their right to Judaism. And I think that has an awful lot to do with the history between Judaism and Christianity, but that's not the point here. The point is, a lot of people who agree with Netanyahu's agenda overall, very much displeased with what the ultra-Orthodox have been able to accomplish. And a lot of these people are even ultra-Orthodox. This is just one of the many things. Also, seemingly more power being centralized in the prime minister. That's something that has caused people to be turned away from Netanyahu. More of a police state within the state of Israel. More militarization and seeming push towards martial law. That has been something that people have not liked very much about Netanyahu. There is a certain level of distaste for his policies, but that's not something that is really any sort of matter when it comes to the general political field or this coalition. The left wing in Israel practically does not exist. The most popular left-wing party being Labor, which, as we're going to see later on, actually only has 7 seats in the current government. But nonetheless, let's go back into the article here. I've been ranting for a moment. Under a rotation deal, Bennett will serve first as prime minister, followed by Lapid. And we're going to get to some reasons why that's somewhat problematic in the future here, but notice that's the same compromise that was actually made by Netanyahu and Benny Gantz that ended up falling apart and leading to this 4th election. So there's still a level of instability that could lead to a potential 5th election, and there's an even deeper layer of instability that could potentially arise considering the political diversity of this coalition. But we'll get to that later. No date has been set for a vote in Parliament to approve the new government, and that, of course, could delay indefinitely considering the fact that Netanyahu is in power. In a televised speech, Bennett called on Yariv Levin, Parliament Speaker and Netanyahu loyalist, not to try and buy time to encourage members of the new coalition to defect, and said he should hold the vote on Wednesday. There was no immediate comment from Levin. I will absolutely try to be reporting on Wednesday about that vote. It should be easy for me to do in the morning because Israel is nearly an entire day ahead of us as far as time is concerned. But we will see, of course, if that is possible. Like I said, a lot of hecticness happening here as far as my life is concerned right now because of going down to a trip down to South Dakota. However, after the 21st of this month, hecticness will be officially over. And everything will be settled and we will be able to move forward. And at that point, these watchdogs will be more consistent. Those of you who are also unapologetics fans, which I think is basically my entire audience at this point, will know that I have been working on stabilizing unapologetics already. Watchdogs, since they are already on hiatus, being kind of left to the wayside a little bit, but I don't want them to be left to the wayside, so we're, of course, returning. Anyways, quote, let go, let the country move forward, excuse me, end quote, Bennett said, addressing his remarks to Netanyahu, who has been in office since 2009. That is right, 12 years, and that's something that's somewhat strange for Americans to think about, though it has actually happened here before in the case of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But for any American who has been born since 1945, and even the majority of Americans born in the latter portions of Roosevelt's administration, as they would be very, very young, really have no concept of rulers lasting this long. Of course, numerous rulers in our last 70 years have only actually had a single term, in some cases even less due to certain circumstances, right? Just to name a few, President Donald Trump, President George H.W. Bush, President Jimmy Carter, President Gerald Ford, President John F. Kennedy, President Harry Truman. No, sorry, not Harry Truman. But you get the idea, right? So on and so forth. Although Richard Nixon did get a second term, rather, he did not get to fulfill his second term. So just the idea of having a ruler ruling that long, right, is somewhat foreign to us. It's not 100% foreign to parliamentary systems because they don't tend to have term limits, and they do tend to have certain ways of restricting the prime minister's power, even if he does rule for a long period of time. Though, of course, having power for a long period of time makes it easier and easier to actually erode those checks and balances. Netanyahu's tenure has been colluded by a corruption trial in which he has denied any wrongdoing, but he has won praise at home and abroad for Israel's quick rollout of COVID-19 vaccinations. Now, I myself was originally a defender of Netanyahu and the corruption and fraud charges. I have now come to believe that they are valid. That is an episode in and of itself. However, that is something that I have come to believe, but I'm open to the possibility that I'm wrong on that. By the way, I see here in the comments, Brother Nicholas is actually here, the one who made our overlay. Shalom. He says, I need to make the light more transparent so it's easier to see the screen share. Yeah, this is the first time I've actually paid attention to the screen itself because I'm reading the screen. It's not actually on or showing the overlay, right? Because I'm just reading it using the screen share. So I guess you are actually right there. That is a little difficult to see. I appreciate you noticing that. I'll try and zoom in a little bit more so that perhaps that'll make it easier. But shalom, and thank you for being here. Fraud and surrender. The prospective new government caps political jockeying since the election. People angry at the planned alliance have held protests outside the homes of opposition politicians whose security has been beefed up after threats on social media. Quote, we, my friends, and I in Likud, we will vehemently oppose the establishment of this dangerous government of fraud and surrender, Netanyahu said. And if, God forbid, it is established, we will bring it down very quickly, end quote. And by the way, the fact that there is such a strong opposition to this politically, as well as the fact that there is such a strong opposition to this seemingly from the people of Israel themselves, could indicate, though it does not necessarily indicate, that this coalition is not going to last very long. So we'll see whether or not that ends up being the case. Of course, it may not end up happening at all. We'll see on Wednesday whether or not it is confirmed and whether or not we actually do move forward. In a rare public warning, the head of Shin Bet International Security Agency, Internal Security Agency, said on Saturday that increasingly extreme online discourse could lead to violence. You need to understand it is different in Israel than here in the United States. There is already certain levels of violence in Israel internally, right? We obviously are all aware of the violence that just took place in a second Gaza war. But even internally, whether it be some radical leftists, whether it be from very, very right-wing nationalistic, ultra-Orthodox type groups, whether it be from Islamists, there is an awful lot of violence, politically speaking, in the nation of Israel at this point. It's an incredibly unstable nation, though not to the point of like third world nations, right? But more, less stable than what you would typically see in your average European nation, right? After all, this is the fourth election they have had in only 2 years. And it is still possible a fifth election could happen, though it's becoming less and less likely, absolutely. While condemning violence and incitement, Netanyahu, who is 71, repeated his designation of the Lapid-Bennett coalition as a leftist alliance that would put Israel at risk. An interesting note, considering neither Lapid nor Bennett are leftist. He said the diverse partnership would be unable to stand up to Washington over Iran's nuclear program or confront Gaza's Hamas militant group that fought with Israel for 11 days last month before a fragile ceasefire went into effect. A very fragile ceasefire indeed. Bennett, who heads the far-right Yamina party, I do not consider them to be far-right myself, but we'll get to that in a moment, and advocates annexation of parts of the occupied so-called West Bank. I added the word so-called just so you know, but it is properly understood as Judea and Samaria. Bennett, who heads the far-right Yamina party and advocates annexation of parts of the occupied so-called West Bank and so-called occupied as well, said Netanyahu's description of the coalition as being extreme leftist was another lie. And that is the end of the article there, but you can see just how tense the situation there actually is. Now, real quick, I do want to give a little bit of my commentary on whether or not I actually think this coalition will survive. Whether or not I actually think this coalition is a good thing, what I think will come from this coalition. We're going to go ahead and look at the coalition here in a moment, but let me go ahead and type it in. I should have done this earlier, and I apologize. Just a moment. All right. Members of the new coalition, this is the second portion we're going to get into, and I'm going to start now to give some of my commentary on the coalition itself and what I think about all of this, right? So, number one, like I said, do tend to believe that Netanyahu is kind of a corrupt politician. I think he is tending towards a dictatorship. I absolutely believe that he was a very solid prime minister for a very long period of time, that he was a solid defender of the Jewish people's right to exist, of Israel, when being surrounded by very vicious enemies. He has effectively proven to the state of Israel, I think, that the left-wing parties are, essentially ridiculous. There's a lot of good things that Netanyahu did, absolutely. But Netanyahu has recently tended towards dictatorship, I think, and I pointed out some of the reasons why earlier when it comes to not advocating at a state level, but basically turning a blind eye at a state level to persecution of Messianic Jews. Certainly allowing at a state level persecution of Messianic Jews in the sense that they are not recognized as Jews, are not considered to have rights as Jews, and are not considered to be Israeli citizens, and therefore have Israeli citizen rights. The same thing has been allowed in that regard to happen to Karaites and Ethiopian Jews, though that has not necessarily manifested itself in violent persecution. And I have said numerous times that I don't know that Israel won't actually have state-endorsed persecution of Karaite and Messianic Jews at some point, though I don't think they will end up having state-endorsed persecution of Ethiopian Jews. I think that will slide. And a big portion of the reason for that has been Netanyahu's allowing of Chabad and Haredi ultra-nationalist members of the Knesset who do not have very much support from Israel, nor did they have very much power themselves as far as by themselves. They weren't getting elected in huge numbers, in other words, allowing them to have a lot of power in his government and allowing them to do things that is leading to the persecution and marginalization of certain groups, which absolutely do deserve rights in the Israeli state, in my own opinion, of course. I am, of course, a commentator in another nation. So you keep that in mind. But nonetheless, these are my thoughts, and you guys, of course, are here for the purposes of receiving my thoughts, right? But these things are very problematic, in my opinion. And also, Netanyahu is somewhat of a shill for the United States. I know that might sound kind of weird, especially coming from an American conservative. However, it is important for us to understand that Israel, as well as many other nations in the world, have essentially become puppet states to an American hegemony that really could be properly described as an empire. And they don't have a lot of sovereignty. And as I have said numerous times here, I believe it will come to bite them. It has already come to bite them numerous times with us handicapping their military, handicapping their ability to annex Judea and Samaria, as well as Gaza and the Golan Heights. They were not allowed to recognize Jerusalem as their capital in any legitimate sense, as far as international politics is concerned, nor annex the Golan Heights until they had a United States president who allowed them to do so and gave them his good graces, namely United States President Donald Trump. That would be because they are a puppet state. They are handicapped whenever we tell them they are handicapped. We negotiate peace deals for them. We negotiate the Abraham Accords for them. They're in many ways a colony of the United States, even though we don't necessarily get all the benefits of having them as a colony. And again, it's not something that is unique to Israel. It happens to many nations across the world. You could think Saudi Arabia, you could think South Korea, you could think the Philippines, you could think Honduras, right? It's a very common thing. It just happens to have much more dramatic impact on the world in regards to Israel because Israel is such an impactful nation. Historically, culturally, religiously, so on and so forth. And there are numerous politicians who have talked about this for long periods of time. Again, I quote Rabbi Meir Kahane, who compared the Israeli nation to a junkie waiting for its fix from its dealer, namely the United States. And I think that certainly is more the case under Netanyahu than it has been under any prime minister ever. And that's another big problem that I have with Netanyahu. That said, I don't expect either of those two things that I just talked about to actually change under this new coalition. Naftali Bennett is certainly not a advocate for Karaite Jewish rights, or for conservative or reform Jewish rights, or for Messianic Jewish rights, or for what's the other group? Ethiopian Jewish rights, right? He's never shown any indication that he cares at all about these groups. He is certainly interested in lessening the power of the ultra-Orthodox, and that's absolutely going to take place if this new coalition government gets its way. However, as we were just kind of talking about, first off, some of the damage is already done, right? Like they already have power in the sense that Messianic Jews, Karaite Jews, etc., are not recognized as Israeli citizens. Marriages and conversions to even conservative and reforms are not recognized at the state level, so on and so forth. But also, as I was already saying, one of the bigger problems is really the Israeli government just turning a blind eye, specifically the persecution of Messianic Jews, right? Again, it comes as a shock to the American conservative, but our Christian brothers and sisters of the Jewish ethnicity are actually murdered, literally murdered, in the state of Israel for their faith, not by the state, but by religious extremists, of the Haredi Jewish tradition. And the state of Israel thus far has turned a blind eye to it. And at some point this month, I promise you guys, we will absolutely go in depth into that whole thing so that you guys understand that I am not making that up. But I suspect that it will at some point make its way to the state level, and it'll get a lot worse. Because right now, they are isolated incidents of persecution, as well as a state just general disrecognition of their status as citizens and Jews, right? But I do think it'll make its way to the state level as far as their killing. I genuinely believe that. And there's a big portion a big reason that I believe that. It's because the state thus far has turned a blind eye to persecution of these people at the hands of Haredi Jewish people, at the hands of the Chabad Jewish people. These are ultra-Orthodox groups. Groups, by the way, which I do have a great deal of respect for in a lot of ways, but which are nonetheless deniers of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and which are haters of the truth and haters of our brothers and sisters in Christ who live in the truth. And sometimes in the state of Israel, yes, in the Holy Land where there is actually freedom, where they actually do allow elections, where they actually do allow freedom of the press and things of that nature, there is problems, my friends, and it includes the deaths, literally the deaths of your brothers and sisters in Christ. I want you to understand that. And I don't think that will change under this new coalition. Because, yes, sure, you don't have ultra-Orthodox anymore. But are you going to continue to turn a blind eye to their persecutions? Also, you do still have members of this government which are certainly not only anti-Christian, but anti-Messianic in particular. And it is important to note that non-Jewish Christians do not experience the same level of persecution in the in the state of Israel as Jewish Christians. They do experience certain levels, such as restrictions of their freedom of speech and freedom of the press, but they are usually considered to be citizens, number one, and number two, they don't tend to have any violence done against them for the most part, right? In fact, very often they tend to be, in many instances, firmly anti-Zionist. There's a lot of Orthodox there, and that's a very common sentiment amongst Orthodox Christians. And even anti-Semitic sometimes, but nonetheless. You do have the replacement of those groups of people with other groups of people which are anti-Messianic, which are anti-Christian. For example, the Islamist Ra'am Party. That Ra'am Party, which was going to be a member of a coalition that was going to link Haredi and Ra'am together, which I still fear may come in the future. They are actually still a member of this coalition, right? In other words, the coalition did do away with one of the kind of scary groups here, but not both of them. Also, Naftali Bennett's own group, a group that I largely even agree with in many instances, does have its flaws, and among those flaws is a seeming level of support for the persecution of certain groups, namely Messianic Jews. Though they do claim to be a more secular version of the nationalist Zionist wing, which I don't even think is necessarily a good thing. What you need is moderation, not secularization, in my opinion. But nonetheless, they're not allies of Messianic Jews by any stretch of the imagination. Naftali Bennett was very much a friend of Benjamin Netanyahu until only recently, right? So I don't think those things are going to change. Also, I do actually tend to agree with Netanyahu in that I think this coalition is weak. I think it's fragile. I think it will probably fall apart very quickly. You'll see a fifth election soon. Maybe it's not this year. Maybe they are able to stave it off long enough that the fifth election is the last election. That could be possible. And in that case, you could even say this is a success as a government because it reestablishes unity in the state of Israel. I am skeptical of that happening, though. And frankly, I think that this is just as fragile as the coalition that we just had recently that fell apart and led to us having a fourth election in the first place in the state of Israel, right? And I think we probably will see a fifth election before 2021 is through, if I'm being honest. At least before a year has passed. So before June of 2022, I think that will certainly occur. And I also agree that this coalition will likely be weak in other regards. Like, for example, are they going to actually reestablish Israeli sovereignty? I mean, unlikely. Menachem Begin said he would. He didn't. Netanyahu said he would. He didn't. Many groups say that they will. They do not. The basic fact of the matter is Israeli politicians are petrified, absolutely petrified of losing United States support. They absolutely, positively feel as if they will not survive without United States support. They very much are the junkie that Meir Kahane said that they were, right? And I don't in any way, shape, or form see Lapid or Bennett changing that. Talk all the talk that they want. I just don't see it happening. The last Israeli politician who I think was actually serious about that was actually Kahana himself. He died in 1990. Before then, there were some. I think Menachem Begin at one time probably would have been that person. When he became prime minister, he was not that person, right? And what does that mean? Well, it does mean potentially a Palestinian state, even though Naftali Bennett has said he isn't very, very much opposed to it. We've already seen some of that come to pass in that Naftali Bennett has agreed as part of this coalition that he will not annex any part of the so-called West Bank, properly known as Judea and Samaria. He will not do it. Not only do I disagree with that, but Naftali Bennett disagrees with that. But he has decided to put that aside for the sake of this unity government. Okay? So we're already seeing that particular capitulation. What else does it mean? It means probably the continuation of the Abraham Accords. What else does it mean? It means probably the continuation of the handicapping of the Israeli military in regards to how it deals with its enemies. What else does it likely mean? It probably means the continuation of a push towards internationalization of the old city. I do still believe that we are on the path towards seeing the establishment of a Palestinian state, seeing the establishment of West Jerusalem as the capital of that Palestinian state, seeing Old Jerusalem internationalized and made the headquarters of a UN of religions, and seeing a temple that is known as the prayer house for all nations there. A lot of you might be wondering, how is that possible, considering so much of what you were talking about recently seems to have fallen apart? And the truth of the matter is, if what we were talking about recently has seemed to have fallen apart, it can only be understood as temporarily, because the ball is rolling when it comes to certain things, right? The Levitical priesthood is being established. Plans for the temple are being set up. The Temple Mount movement is gaining in popularity. They have found a way to build this building without violating the quote-unquote status quo or destroying in any way, shape, or form the Dome of the Rock. The United Nations of Religions is already well towards its establishment. The recognition of the state of Palestine is well accepted in Christian communities and in the rest of the world, save the United States and evangelical Christian communities. Okay, so we're going to get to that point. It does appear that God has stayed that off. And I thank the Lord for that, because I personally believe that that is a big, big sign that we're towards the end. I don't want us to be, to not remain vigilant, because this could definitely be one of those things where, you know, in a time that you think not, says the scriptures. But nonetheless, those things are important to note. But I still think we are well on our path towards those things, towards the establishment of a Palestinian state in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, towards West Jerusalem as their capital, towards internationalization of the old city, towards a UN of religions being stationed there, probably headed by the Vatican, and towards the establishment of a temple there. So that's what I think about these elections. And real quick, I want to show you guys the breakdown of this election. Okay. So the largest party, as you can see, is actually Likud. One of the things you need to note about the Israeli system of governance is that they don't operate the same way the United States goes as far as having a two-party system. In parliamentary systems, and this is common throughout the world, you tend to have multiple parties and you vote for parties rather than people. And then based on what percentage of the vote you received, you get a certain allotment of parties within the legislative branch, commonly called parliament, but known as the Knesset in Israel, which means assembly, by the way. And is the same word used in the Bible for congregation, which you would translate in the Greek as ecclesia, which is where we get ecclesiol, which is an old word referring to church. Fun fact. But nonetheless. So they are the largest party, but they needed to establish a majority coalition government because 30 is not 61. 61 is half. And in order to actually do anything, you do need at least half of the nation with you. The second group is Yesh Atid, led by the previously mentioned Yair Lapid. Now let's go ahead and look into a little bit of Yesh Atid, see what they are about. Means there is a future. You can see that actually right here. There is a future, right? And it is led by Yair Lapid, who is going to end up being the prime minister if everything goes through in about a year and a half after Naftali Bennett's stint there, right? The party is big on the following, as you can see here. We'll get to the actual portion where it describes ideology. Obviously, Zionism, but specifically a liberal version of Zionism, meaning a nationalism for the Jewish state, right? Anti-clericalism. This is very important because it does actually mean there is somewhat of a hope for weakening of the ultra-Orthodox party, as I had just pointed out, though that might not be the case considering some of the other parties that actually are going to be a part of this coalition. Yair Lapid is actually going to lead Yesh Atid in being a part of this coalition, obviously. But nonetheless, he has opposition to the religious authority of certain groups, and of course, in this case, it would be Chabad and Haredi, the religious authority that they have at the state level, right? He's opposed to that, and the whole party is opposed to that. Economic liberalism is actually a little bit deceiving if you are an American. Economic liberalism means essentially capitalism, though not necessarily free market capitalism. It could mean free market capitalism, though it does not necessarily mean free market capitalism. It is important to note, though, that this does put Yesh Atid in opposition to the current Israeli establishment, which, though it is capitalistic, is very restricted and socialistic compared to standards we might have here in the United States. As you can see here, secularism is a big portion. That obviously is just sort of the same thing as their anti-clericalism. Liberalism is a big portion of their ideology, as you can see, based on ideas of liberty, consent of the governed, things like that. They're not real big on traditions. They're not real big on, as I said, religious authority, but really just in respecting of religious institutions in general, which, of course, is the opposite problem. And as you can see down here, they are advocates of the two-state solution, which, of course, is the idea that Palestine should be established in at least Judea and Samaria, but potentially also in Gaza. To get more specific as to the ideology that is being presented here, go ahead and get rid of a lot of this stuff. Platform. In the application submitted to the party registrar, Lapid listed the party's 8 goals. According to the statement, these include changing the priorities in Israel with an emphasis on civil life, education, housing, health, transport, and policing, as well as improving the condition of the middle class. So more state involvement in civil life. So that's one thing. Changing the system of government. He doesn't specify how exactly, but in some way, shape, or form, changing the system of government. Equality in education and the draft. All Israeli school students must be taught essential classes. All Israelis will be drafted into the army, and all Israeli citizens will be encouraged to seek work, including the ultra-Orthodox sector and the Arab sector. This is actually something I personally would agree with, and this is something that actually a lot of people on Israel's right wing would agree with, including some ultra-Orthodox. There is a split in the ultra-Orthodox. There tends to be a split between Kahanists and everybody else who is ultra-Orthodox, but nonetheless. Fighting political corruption, including corruption in government in the form of institutions like minister without portfolio, opting for a government of 18 ministers at most, fortifying the rule of law and protecting the status of the High Court of Justice. Growth and economic efficiency. Creating growth engines as a way of fighting poverty, combating red tape, removing barriers, improving the transportation system, reducing the cost of living and housing costs, and improving social mobility through assistance to small businesses. As you can see, he does very much approve of state involvement in the economy, in education, in maintaining equality. He's just not real into the what we would call the church in America, but of course the just basically religious authorities maintaining any level of authority in those matters. Legislation of education law in cooperation with teachers unions, eliminating most of the matriculation exams, raising the differential education index, and increasing school autonomy, enacting a constitution to regulate tense relations between population groups in Israel. It is important to note there is not actually a constitution in Israel. They have the basic laws, but the basic laws are not as binding as a constitution and can be changed by the vote of the Knesset. Striving for peace, according to the outline of 2 states for 2 peoples, while maintaining the large Israeli settlement blocks and ensuring the safety of Israel. Other positions they have: creating greater pluralism in religion, diversity and equality between Jews and all movements of Judaism within Israel by instituting public funding by the state for the non-Orthodox movements within Judaism, such as Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and Humanistic movements, similar to the public funding of the Orthodox chief rabbinate by the state. Notice this isn't actually separation of church and state. It is simply getting all of the different religions involved in the state. Notice also it does not seem to include the most persecuted groups, namely Messianic Jews and Karaites. Allowing non-Orthodox movements to perform religious conversions and weddings and have their conversions and weddings accepted as legitimate by the state. I do agree with that. Allowing egalitarian prayer between men and women and all Orthodox and non-Orthodox religious movements at the Western Wall. I do also agree with that. I would also agree with a ending of the status quo as far as not allowing Jews to ascend the mount and pray on the mount. It is, after all, their holiest site. Instituting civil marriage in Israel, including between same-sex couples. So he is certainly a fan of getting the religious authorities out of marriage and as well getting a support for homosexuality, right? Partial operation of public transportation on Saturdays, which is not actually a thing at the moment due to respect for Shabbat. And that is something, of course, I would disagree with, as is his instituting civil marriage and allowing the civil marriage between same-sex couples. Although I do obviously agree that conservatives and reforms have the right to do that themselves, which they do indeed do. And renewing peace negotiations with the Palestinians and halting construction in Israeli settlements, both of which I would disagree with as well. So that's Yesh Atid. That is what they are all about. Some of their things I agree with. Like I said, a lot of it I do not. Then we see Shas, a very religious party that is not going to be a member of the coalition. As you can see, they are a Haredi, religious party, and they were founded in 1984 by Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. They are very much a far-right party as far as wanting the establishment of Torah Judaism as law. I tend to sympathize with that personally, as it pertains at least to Israel, for very complicated political philosophy reasons that I cannot get into at this moment. Blue and white, we're very familiar with those if we're longtime watchers, right? They're basically just a big tent that has completely fallen apart, as you can see, with only 8. They are also going to be members of this coalition, which, by the way, brings that up to 25 if you're keeping count. Yamina, that is Naftali Bennett's group. What is Yamina and what are they about? Yamina is obviously Zionist and conservative, right? Having national conservatism, meaning they are very interested in nationalism, very interested in cultural identity, something that is a little bit of something that I would agree with, but not necessarily in the United States. Again, complicated, don't have time to go into it now. They are split, as you can see, between those who believe in religious Zionism and those who believe in secularism. They are a populist group. They believe in economic liberalism, which again leaves them opposed to the group at large. Now, as you just saw, Yesh Atid does believe in economic liberalism. However, it is a very, very statist economic liberalism. It is certainly accurate to say Naftali Bennett and Yamina are less statist in that regard, for sure. And a big portion of the stuff that they are about is nationalism and annexation of Judea and Samaria, which, of course, is absolutely going to be handicapped by the fact that Labor, blue and white, Yesh Atid, are members of this coalition. And, of course, they have even signed away their rights to do so, saying they will not actually seek annexation of the so-called Palestinian territories. Nonetheless, let's get a little bit more about their ideology. So, Ayelet Shakid listed 11 principles that the Yamina list is determined to uphold. Jewish identity. We will work to strengthen the Jewish identity of the state of Israel and to strengthen the connection of Israeli students to the Torah, the land of Israel, and the Jewish religious heritage. It is important to note, I am completely in agreement with Yamina in this regard. I am a firm believer in nationalism for all nations. I have been very influenced by Edmund Burke, by Meir Kahane, by numerous other political thinkers. And I am all on board with Yamina when it comes to these things. But we are seeing already Yamina starting to compromise on these things in forming this coalition government. And it has a lot to do with their very firm opposition to Benjamin Netanyahu. Nationality. We will act for the implementation of the nation's state law and the prevention of any harm to it, while continuing to ensure individual rights and equality for all Israeli citizens. Unity of the land. We are the only party that opposes the establishment of a Palestinian state, which they obviously just sacrificed, and any withdrawal from the territory of the land of Israel. By the way, that's actually not true. Likud is certainly weaker on this than they once were. But there are many people within Likud who are still opposed to a Palestinian state. Sovereignty. We will act for the full and equitable application of national sovereignty and the rule of law to all citizens and residents of Israel, including the end of military administration of Judea and Samaria, and the application of Israeli sovereignty to the territory of Judea, Samaria, and the Jordan Valley. Again, that has already been sacrificed just by setting up this coalition. He agreed that he was not going to do points 2 and 3 of the reason his party exists. And that did not go the other way, by the way. There was no agreement on the part of Labor, on the part of Blue and White, on the part of Yesh Atid, on the part of Yair Lapid to actually withhold from establishing a Palestinian state or withdrawing from Israel or anything like that. Determination against terror. We will defeat terrorism with determination and without compromise, or with determination rather and without compromise. We will defeat Gaza border terrorism and end the allowances paid to terrorists by the Palestinian Authority. Again, sacrificed just by making this coalition. We will bring back the corpses of IDF soldiers and charge a price from Hamas for its actions while they sign up with an Islamist party. I'm not saying Likud would have been better. Likud was just about to sign up with this Islamist party as well, as were all of the Haredi Jewish groups. But let's be clear, okay? Both the government being replaced in Israel and the government replacing in Israel is made up of people who are not actually about their business. With total resistance to the release of imprisoned terrorists, we will act to assist disabled IDF veterans and the victims of the conflict. Point number 5, Aliyah. We will work towards the implementation of a national Aliyah policy, which will promote Jewish immigration and remove unnecessary barriers to immigration. We'll see if that ends up being the case. We will prevent illegal immigration of migrant workers to Israel and prevent the abuse of family reunification policies. Point number 6, competition and liberty. We will promote competition to break up monopolies and cartels, open the economy to international competition, and reduce central planning in the economy. Very much agree with them on that on that point, rather. We will promote competition in the housing market, release land for construction, and implement taxation policies that will spur development. Obviously, you can see this is also opposed by Yair Lapid and his party, although we don't see any indication that Bennett has signed away his right to actually pursue this particular aspect of his agenda. We will promote competition in the housing market, release land for construction, and implement taxation policies that will spur development. We will streamline regulation, reduce the regulatory burden on employers, which will encourage employment and productivity and create a comfortable environment for sharing economy and the high-tech industry. Point number 7, right to work. We will reform the labor law so that unions can only represent all workers in a workplace if they have a majority of its workers unionized. We will implement mandatory government arbitration to solve labor disputes in essential government services and increase transparency in labor organizations. We will strengthen the values of governability and democracy. We will strengthen the status of the Knesset as a legislative authority and restore confidence in the Supreme Court, something that he actually does agree with Yair Lapid on, as the judicial authority in accordance with the law. We will strengthen the status of elected officials in the face of the unelected bureaucracy. And it is important to note that if Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett are actually serious about those two things, we will see somewhat of a return to freedom in Israel. And that will, of course, be good. Social responsibility. We will enact economic and medical protection for the disabled and the elderly while integrating people with disabilities in education, society, and the labor market. Galilee and Negev. We will strengthen the Galilee and the Negev with additional employment opportunities, housing, healthcare, tourism, culture, and transport. We will encourage capital investment and private initiatives that will strengthen human capital and allow families to settle and remain in the Galilee and the Negev. We will strengthen agriculture and labor settlements. Alongside these united principles, each party pertains for its own independent platform. Thus, the new right represents the more liberal religious and secular right. The Jewish home represents mainstream religious Zionism, with Takuma representing the more hawkish and Hardal religious Zionist. Hardal is an ideology in Israel that we do not have the time to go into at the moment. Let's see, going back to... that was the wrong thing I wanted. So, that is Yamina. And we're not going to go into all of the other members of this group, but you do definitely need to know who they are. But Yamina and Yesh Atid are the main players, and Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid are the two who are going to be interchangeable prime ministers if everything follows through, with Bennett being the first and the one we're going to discuss today as a result. I'm sorry that we're going over an hour. This is going to be probably a 2-hour show, but important things that we need to discuss nonetheless. So, if you're keeping count, Yesh Atid, Blue and White, Yamina, all members, that puts them up at 32. Labor is the next member group, puts them up at 39. Labor is the largest left-wing party, or at least was for some time, though technically Yair Lapid and Yesh Atid are absolutely more centrist than Labor are. Labor is a Marxist party. It may come as a shock to Americans to know that there is Marxism in Israel, but actually it was quite popular for some time. And in fact, the original prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, was very influenced by Marxist thought, though he himself was not a full-blown Marxist. Excuse me. So, Labor also, like I said, is a member that you have here. New Hope as well, led by Gideon Sa'ar, which is actually a somewhat right-wing party, part of this new right coalition. They have another 6, puts them up at 45. Maretz is another one of the parties here. They are left-wing, and as you can see, they're green. They are also a member there, putting them at 51. You have also Ra'am, which gets them up to 55. And there is a couple other parties which are members of this coalition as well. And you can see them down here with some of these other groups, namely the United Arab List, which, by the way, puts them up at 59. And I'm missing someone, but I don't know who I'm missing at the moment. But there are 2 groups which I am missing. Let's see. Let's go ahead and just look this up here because it'll actually tell me. Apologize, friends, for the lack of organization there. But nonetheless, we press forward. Where is a solid list? Please give me a list. All right, here we are. So, you have the 17 members of Yesh Atid, the 8 members of Blue and White, the 7 members of the Labor Party, Yisrael Beiteinu, that's what I forgot, actually, and I added a group that was not there. I don't know which group I added, but nonetheless. Then Yamina, New Hope, Meretz, and the United Arab List. Was it Ra'am? Maybe it was Ra'am. I don't believe it was. Yeah. No, it was not. No, it was not. I'm not sure what's going on there. Ra'am is absolutely... Oh, sorry. United Arab List is Ra'am. Obviously. Duh. See, that's me being stupid. I'm not an expert on Israeli politics. I'm very much informed, but I'm not an expert, right? So definitely check your sources, and that includes me. You just saw an example of that. But nonetheless, those are the 61 members of this new coalition government. Yesh Atid, Blue and White, Ra'am, Meretz, Labor, Yisrael Beiteinu, Yamina, and New Hope. And these groups are very much all over the place. Meretz is left-wing green. Labor is left-wing socialist. Yamina is nationalist right. Blue and White is big tent coalition. Yesh Atid is center-left. Ra'am is Islamist, so on and so forth, right? The coalition here is definitely not unified in their policies by any stretch. They're unified simply in their want to have unity, number one, and in their opposition to Netanyahu, number two. The next thing that we need to obviously discuss, though, is the recent men elected. So, first question is, who is Naftali Bennett? Who is the man who is going to allegedly be the very next prime minister of Israel? And of course, we already went through his Yamina party. We already went through what they believe and some of the different things that they have given up for the right to form this coalition government. But who is this guy? What's he all about? And should we be worried about him? Should we not be worried about him? What's going to happen to international politics, so on and so forth? By the way, while we are here, I want to briefly say, if you guys are interested, please consider liking, please consider sharing, please consider hitting that bell so you are notified every time we go live. And also, please consider giving to us financially if you believe that this is a message worth getting out there, and if you believe that this is something that needs to be done, if this is work that needs to be done, right? So who is Naftali Bennett? Shoot, I was hoping that would get rid of the ads, but it did not. Nonetheless, who is Naftali Bennett? The man who could be Israel's next prime minister. This is from the Times of Israel. Yamina Party chief and former IDF commando turned millionaire tech entrepreneur who entered politics as an aide to Netanyahu, whom he now seeks to oust. Naftali Bennett, who on Sunday moved a step closer to replacing Israel's veteran Premier Benjamin Netanyahu, is a millionaire former tech entrepreneur who made a name in politics with hardline right-wing rhetoric. The 49-year-old, who has made pitches to hard-right voters throughout his career, leads the Yamina Party, which has called for Israel to annex parts of the so-called West Bank. With a discreet kippah and perfect American English, he is ultra-liberal on the economy and takes a hard line on Iran. Ultra-liberal meaning capitalistic. Remember, liberalism when it comes to the economy is what we in America would consider conservatism when it comes to the economy. He shares his ideology with Netanyahu and has served in several of the Likud leaders' governments. But in recent years, the two have become increasingly opposed. In the aftermath of 11 days of deadly fighting with Palestinian terrorists in the Gaza Strip, Bennett finally agreed to join centrist Yair Lapid in a coalition to oust the premier. It's important to note he is a left-wing centrist who has, meaning more on the left side of the center, who has been in power for 12 consecutive years, as well as an earlier 3-year term. In other words, the Gaza war itself seems to be what pushed Bennett in supporting this new coalition government. Lapid has offered to share power, letting Bennett serve the first term in a rotating premiership. In a speech late Sunday, Bennett claimed leftist parties could back him to lead a coalition government. We're seeing that happen with Marxist in the case of Labor, leftist centrist in the case of Yair Lapid, and Green politicians in the case of Meretz. Excuse me. And by the way, not only do we see the voters of Yamina being definitely let down in this case, but also the voters in Israel in general being let down. I mean, how insane is it that a party which has only 7 out of 120 members, right? Let's go ahead and check out again what percentage of the vote they actually received. Some of you have already done the math in your head, no doubt. But 7 out of 120 members, my friends. Look at this. 6.2%. Only 6.2% of Israelis support this party, and yet the leader of this party is now going to be the leader of this entire nation. Could you imagine? Could you imagine? So not only has Yamina betrayed its base, but the state of Israel itself has betrayed the Jewish people, as states very often do. But nonetheless, quote, the left is making far from easy compromises here when it bestows upon me the role of prime minister, end quote, he said. Lapid has until late Wednesday to cobble together a 61-seat coalition in the 120-seat Knesset, and as we just pointed out, it does appear that will occur. Religious nationalist Yamina, that is not accurate, they are officially secularist, but nonetheless we'll let that slide, won 7 seats in the country's last general election in March, although one member has refused to join an anti-Netanyahu coalition. So only 6 members are actually joining the 61-seat coalition. A former Special Forces commando, Bennett is the son of U.S.-born parents and lives with his wife, Galit, and 4 children in the central city of Ra'anana. He entered politics after selling his tech startup company for $145 million, so he's quite rich, in 2005, and the next year became chief of staff to Netanyahu, who was then in the opposition. After leaving Netanyahu's office, Bennett served in 2010. Bennett in 2010 became director of the Yesha Council, which lobbies for Jewish settlers in the West Bank. All right, which of course he has now given up. He then took politics by storm in 2012 when he took charge of the National Religious Jewish Home Party, which was facing political disaster. He increased its parliamentary presence fourfold while making headlines with a series of incendiary comments about the Palestinians. In 2013, he said Palestinian terrorists should be killed and not released. He also argues that the West Bank, so-called West Bank, is not under occupation, which I agree with him on, by the way, because, quote, there was never a Palestinian state here, end quote, and that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should not be resolved but must be endured like a piece of shrapnel in the buttocks. Very interesting analogy for him to use. Beyond holding the defense portfolio, Bennett has served as Netanyahu's economy minister and education minister. He rebranded Jewish Home as Yamina, meaning rightward, in 2018 and was part of Netanyahu's coalition, which collapsed the selfsame year. He was not asked to join a Netanyahu-led unity government in May last year, a move seen as an expression of the premier's personal contempt toward him despite their shared ideology. In opposition with the coronavirus pandemic raging in 2020, Bennett dampened his right-wing rhetoric to focus on the health crisis, moving to broaden his appeal by releasing plans to contain the virus and aid the economy. Quote, in the next years, we need to put aside politics and issues like annexation of a Palestinian state. So as you can see, he's admitting that he's sacrificing that which he believes and focusing on gaining control over the coronavirus pandemic, healing the economy and mending internal rifts, he told Army Radio in November. And it's important to note that while this may look like it is pushing off certain things, that sentiment there, which is indeed the sentiment that is the foundation of the 61-seat government, could indeed continue to push forward some of the worst aspects of the Netanyahu government. namely capitulation to the ultra-Orthodox, namely capitulation to the Palestinians, namely capitulation to the international bodies which wish to see an Abrahamic union and a religious union of all the different faiths internationalized and centered within Jerusalem. So we're not out of the waters yet on that. It does appear we don't have the linking of Haredi, and Ra'am together. It does appear that we do not have the election of a noted Temple Mount advocate as president. And so it does appear that some of the things which I thought would certainly occur, but which did not occur, I do admit that I need to eat crow on those, right? It does appear that because those things did not occur, that perhaps some time has been bought. But it is still possible to go the other way, and we must be ever so vigilant. And this is why not only do I call this the watchdog, but I call on you guys, my audience, to also be watchdogs. This is who this Naftali Bennett character is, and he has, as you can see, sacrificed much of who he is by linking together with a party that is opposed to him on economic liberalism, opposed to him on internationalization, opposed to him when it comes to the Palestinian problem, in the name of an anti-Netanyahu unity. And in many ways, I support and sympathize in the sense that I understand that you want to get rid of this ultra-Orthodox power, even though I don't think you will. And in the sense that I understand that you want to reestablish Israeli sovereignty, even though I don't think you will. And in the sense that I understand that you want to reestablish unity within the Israeli nation so that you don't have such a tumultuous area, corruption in the government, military dictatorship, it seems. And I don't think you will. But I do sympathize with those reasons. But nonetheless, he's already sacrificed so much that who knows what we'll see next. Next, what we want to look into, and this is the last thing we'll look into today because we're already at an hour and 30 minutes. Oh, I had here who is Naftali Bennett, but I never actually used it. Oh, well. Is the new Israeli president. And his name is Isaac Herzog. Again, that is Isaac Herzog. We need to know a little bit about him and who he is. That's, again, going to be the last thing we do here today. There's some other stuff I wanted to get to, but unfortunately, this is already getting too long. Oh, did I not have that? Yes, I do. Here it is. Okay. Isaac Herzog elected 11th president of the state of Israel by a wide margin. Herzog defeated Miriam Peretz in an 87-27 vote, becoming first son of a president to become president. He is the son of Chaim Herzog, by the way, in case you were wondering. Jewish Agency Chairman Isaac Herzog will be the 11th president of the state of Israel after he received 87 votes from MKs in a secret ballot vote in the Knesset plenum. Herzog's opponent, Israel Prize-winning educator Miriam Peretz, received 27 votes and 3 MKs abstained. Had she been elected, Peretz would have become Israel's first female president. Now, of course, you may be wondering, first off, that math doesn't add up to 120. We'll get there. Second off, what about Yehuda Glick, the guy who I actually thought would be elected president? Well, the whole reason he wasn't elected president, at least my own opinion, because I do think he would have won if he did not do this, is that he actually, for some reason, dropped out. Apparently, it was because he thought he was a long shot candidate. As this recent coalition shows, I don't think that was the case at all. But nonetheless, that's what happened. Herzog's opponent, I already read that. Let's see. It was the largest victory in any presidential election in Israel's history. Herzog will take over from President Reuven Rivlin when his term ends on July the 9th. This does not mean we've heard the end of Yehuda Glick or the Temple Mount movement, by the way. So don't think such things. A veteran politician, Herzog is a former head of the Labor Party, which is that socialist party in Israel, a former opposition leader, a former welfare and diaspora minister, and is the son of Chaim Herzog, who served as Israel's president from 1983 to 1993 to 1993. I don't know why I said 17. Herzog handed all the MKs who voted for him, or thanked rather all the MKs who voted for him, and said it was an honor to serve the entire people of Israel. He called Peretz a hero and also an inspiration. Quote, I will be the president of everyone, Herzog said, end quote, singling out Israelis across the political spectrum and diaspora Jewry. Herzog said alongside Netanyahu that he was ready to work with any government and any prime minister. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Yamina leader Naftali Bennett, who is trying to replace him, congratulated Herzog and wished Peretz well. Rivlin spoke with Herzog on the phone and also called Peretz to thank her. Quote, I send you my warmest greetings, Mr. President, Rivlin said. I can tell you that the responsibility of the role that you are about to assume is unlike anything you have done until now. Although, to be fair, it is a ceremonial position, but it is a position of great influence, for sure. The Jewish just sort of refreshed on me. The Jewish and democratic system we established here in the land of our ancestors has a body and soul. If the Knesset is a place of argument, as we have certainly seen recently, the president's residence is a place of discourse, partnership, and statehood, end quote. Rivlin said the title of first citizen and the task of guarding the character of the state of Israel, particularly at this point in time, are heavy responsibilities. And you can see where that influence comes from in his position as the first citizen, quote unquote. Quote, I have no doubt that you will bear these responsibilities superbly, Rivlin said. I am proud to pass on the baton to you in a month's time, end quote. With his victory, Herzog becomes the first president whose father has been president. Chaim Herzog was Israel's sixth president. And again, that was from 1983 to 1993. Every Knesset faction granted its MKs the freedom to vote their conscience rather than binding them by faction discipline. None of the factions endorsed a candidate. This is the first presidential race in Israel in which neither of the two candidates is a current MK. Peretz said she was thrilled that after coming to Israel from Morocco and going to transit camp, she was considered worthy to stand against someone of Herzog's caliber. She said she would continue in her mission to heal the rifts of the nation. In a concession speech alongside Netanyahu, Peretz said that by running, she accomplished what, as a child, she could have not even dreamed of. Quote, a fitting president who honors us was elected, Peretz said. I will pray for his success because his success is our success. Michael Segal, the Jewish Agency's chairman of the Bond of Governors, said Herzog's, quote, unwavering dedication to the Jewish people and to serving the state of Israel is an inspiration, and we will all undoubtedly continue to benefit from his leadership. But of course, that doesn't say a whole lot about what he believes. So let's go ahead and get to some of that here. Obviously, we just showed that he is a member of the Labor Party. So we can see he is a left-wing person, somebody who in the United States would even be considered a far left-wing person. But nonetheless, what does he actually believe? Well, so he won a seat in the 2003 election as a member of the Labor Party and was appointed Minister of Housing and Building at his request when Labor joined Ariel Sharon's coalition government on January 10th, 2005. However, on November 23rd, 2005, he resigned from his cabinet post alongside the rest of the party. Prior to the 2006 elections, Herzog won second place on Labor's list in the party's primaries. He was initially appointed the Minister of Tourism in Ehud Elmert's Kadima-led coalition, but was reassigned to the Social Affairs Ministry in March 2007 after Yisrael Beitenu was awarded the Tourism Ministry following their late entry to the governing coalition, and also appointed Minister of the Diaspora Society and the fight against anti-Semitism. He was again second on the party's list for the 2009 elections. Following the election, he was appointed Minister of Welfare and Social Services and Minister of the Diaspora Society and the fight against anti-Semitism. So the Minister of the Diaspora Society and the fight against anti-Semitism. In January 2009, he was appointed by Prime Minister Ehud Elmert as the Israel government coordinator for the provision of humanitarian aid to the population of Gaza. He later resigned from the cabinet after Ehud Barak left the party to establish independence in January 2001. And just so you know, independence is a political party in Israel. In 2001, Herzog was an unsuccessful candidate for the Labor Party leadership. He finished third in the primaries that year after Shelley Yakimovich and Amir Peretz. On November 22nd, 2013, Herzog was elected leader of the Labor Party, defeating incumbent Shelley Yakimovich, whatever you say, by 58%, 58.5% to 41.5%. In doing so, he became leader of the opposition, which is all those groups in their coalition that are not a member of the coalition government. 10 days after the election, Herzog met with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to pledge his support for a two-state solution. So we've seen a little bit. So he's into welfare. He's into the two-state solution. He's a socialist. Obviously, we're having to sort of bleed a little bit of his ideology out of something that will not just outright tell us, but nonetheless, you can see what it is that he stands for and has stood for in the past. Herzog reportedly reached out to Shas leader Aryeh Deri to increase cooperation between the two opposition factions. And as I said, Shas is a right-wing party, very political and Haredi, and considered to be Hardal, which is Haredi nationalist. In June 2014, Herzog criticized Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for failing to engage the international community, failing to present a proposal for peace with Palestinians, and failure to work effectively with the President of the United States, Barack Obama. So there we go. We see a little bit more of what it is that he stands for. Herzog declared that Netanyahu's loathing and hostility for Barack Obama was one of his greatest failures, since it put Israel's security at risk. And there's more that we could get into here, but you guys get the general idea. He is a leftist for sure. And he is somebody who supports this idea of a two-state solution. So while we did not get the Temple Mount guy in Israel, we did get the two-state guy in Israel. And that is something that is certainly important to note here. Real quick, I want to just point out that the Labor Party, when I say that they are a socialist party, I'm not actually making that up, right? They believe in what's known as social democracy, which is a very light form of socialism, as people such as Leo Filius have pointed out here online. That's actually what Bernie Sanders does believe. He calls it democratic socialism, but really it is social democracy. And we've had people believed such things in the past, varying from hardcore socialists like Eugene V. Debs to more electable Democrats like Franklin Roosevelt. Labor Zionism, which is, as you can see, socialist Zionism. Again, did not make that up. They are socialists. And, of course, the two-state solution. So that's Isaac Herzog, the current president of Israel. That's what he is all about. And like I said, we did not get one element of the problems here in the person who was going to set up a temple, but we did get another element in somebody who is potentially going to set up an international world city as well as the two-state solution. So that's what we have. That's what's going on in the United States of America. Excuse me, not in the United States of America, in Israel itself. In Israel itself. My apologies. So that's what we got here, right? That's the end of our current episode today. And there's a lot more that needs to be gotten into. For example, Israeli police barring right-wing demonstrators in Jerusalem. For example, more about some Canadian Christian persecution that we did not actually get to today. But hopefully we'll talk more about that on Wednesday, as well as have updates on whether or not Israel was able to form this government. But nonetheless, we're out of time, friends. I appreciate you all greatly. If you like this episode, and if you like this content, please remember to like, please remember to share, please remember to get this out to all the different social media platforms you partake in, because of course, what good is is a message without an audience to hear it? Again, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell so you get notified every time we go live. The goal is to go live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And please do consider giving to the Patreon if you think that this work is worth it, if you think that this message is stuff that needs to get out, if you think that this is a political podcast that needs to be addressed. Obviously, I'm coming at this from a couple of unique perspectives, being deeply Christian deeply nationalistic, deeply skeptical of certain things, deeply like globalism and new world governments, deeply into prophecy, and deeply traditionalist in my conservatism. So all of those things, as well as certain things that are not unique to me, like being big on social conservatism, religious conservatism, constitutionalism, libertarianism, things like that. So if you're interested in any of those things, absolutely do. Please consider giving to that Patreon there. And that's all I have for you guys. I appreciate you being here. Lord willing, we will be here on Wednesday. But before we leave, my fellow watchdogs, I have a question for you. In the face of Armageddon, will you compromise? Shalom.